Well, good day. I'm Stephen Ezell, Vice President for Global Innovation Policy at the Information Technology and Innovation Foundation, ITIF, and we welcome you to today's event addressing an allied approach to semiconductor leadership. As we begin today's session, let me note that viewers may submit questions to our panelists via our Slido application, which if you're watching this event on itif.org, there's a form at the bottom of the page where you can enter your questions, or if you're watching on YouTube, there's a link in the event description. Our agenda today will begin with introductory remarks from Senator John Cornyn of Texas, following which I will introduce ITIF's report, an allied approach to semiconductor leadership, and then we'll hear about 6 to 8 minutes of remarks from each of our esteemed panelists before opening it up to audience Q&A. I'll introduce Senator Cornyn when he arrives. He's just finishing up another speech on the floor of the Senate. But let me start then by introducing the co-panelists we'll hear from today. First, John Neuffer. John is President and CEO of the Semiconductor Industry Association, SIA, where he is the leading advocate for setting a policy agenda maintaining U.S. leadership in semiconductor design, manufacturing, and research. John previously served as Senior Vice President at the Information Technology Industry Council, ITI, and for 7 years at the United States Representative's Office with a leading role in developing Asian trade policy. He also worked at the United States Information Technology Office in Beijing. After John, we'll hear remarks from James Lewis of CSIS. James is a Senior Vice President and Director of the Technology Policy Program at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, CSIS. Jim has authored numerous scores of publications on the relationship between technology, innovation, and national power. Jim previously served stints at both the U.S. Department of Commerce and Department of State, and he holds a PhD from the University of Chicago. After James, we'll hear from our two representatives from the U.S. governments. First, Ian Steff. Ian, who Mr. Trump has called Mr. Semiconductor, serves as the Assistant Secretary for Global Markets and Director General of the United States and Foreign Commercial Service. Now, Ian, when your title is that long, they actually don't let us read anything more from your bio. But it might be fair to say that before joining the Department of Commerce in that capacity, Ian had served as the state of Indiana's first Chief Innovation Officer and as Executive Vice President for the Indiana Economic Development Corporation. And then last but not least, delighted to be joined today by Corey Johnston from the U.S. Department of State. Corey serves as the Chief Competition Officer. In this role, he is responsible for advancing American national security and economic competitive interest across the private sector, interagency, and partners and allies. Corey previously served as Senior Advisor for Industrial Policy at the Department of Defense. So we're delighted to have you all with us today, and perfectly timed. Delighted to have Senator John Cornyn join us. Senator Cornyn, can you hear us?
I certainly can. I apologize for the delay.
Not at all. Your timing is impeccable. Let me go ahead and take the opportunity to introduce you, Senator, and then I'll turn the floor over to you.
Thank you.
So Senator John Cornyn was first elected to the U.S. Senate in 2002 and is currently serving his third term. Let me remind all my panelists if they would be sure to have their microphones muted so we don't hear any back noise. Thank you, Jim and Ian. But yeah, Senator Cornyn, as is first elected to the Senate in 2002, Senator Cornyn serves on the Senate Finance, Intelligence, and Judiciary Committees. Like me, actually, a proud native of San Antonio, Texas, Senator Cornyn has served the people of Texas for the last 3 decades as a district judge, a member of the Texas Supreme Court, and as Texas Attorney General before representing the Lone Star State in the U.S. Senate. There, he's been a true champion for America's advanced technology industries, especially semiconductors, and particularly through spearheading the Creating Helpful Incentives to Produce Semiconductors, or CHIPS for America Act, designed to revitalize America's semiconductor competitiveness. That's bipartisan legislation he introduced with Virginia Senator John Warner, and which I'm sure we're going to learn more about presently. Senator Cornyn, thank you so much for joining us. The floor is yours.
Well, thank you, Stephen, and thanks to everybody at ITIF for organizing this event on a very, very timely and important topic. Regardless of how much or how little the average consumer knows about semiconductors, we know that they rely on them every day, and their reliance is dependent in large part on supply chains that stretch across oceans. Semiconductors are everywhere. They're the underlying technology from everything from computers and phones to our military missile defense systems and fighter jets. As technologies have become more sophisticated, semiconductor demand has skyrocketed. In fact, U.S. companies command 47% of the global market share of these integrated circuit chips. But when it comes to making them, not just designing them, but to making them, we are falling further and further behind. Since 2000, the U.S. has dropped from producing roughly a quarter of the world's semiconductors to only 12%. We're not only losing our competitive edge, but also creating a huge vulnerability. If you're looking for an example of why a strong supply chain is so critical, just look at the COVID-19 pandemic. We struggle to keep our hospitals stocked with masks, gloves, and other PPE that our healthcare workers need to keep themselves and their patients safe. Earlier this year, the situation was so dire that hospitals were asking the public to help boost their supplies, taking donations from folks who had extra boxes of N95 masks in their garage and gloves from salons that had closed their doors to customers. We didn't reach that point because of a lack of preparation by our healthcare professionals, but because of our reliance on other countries to produce that medical equipment. China is a major supplier of most of these products, and since much of their stock was sent to hotspots in the earliest days of the pandemic, we were left to rely on a relatively small number of domestic manufacturers. If that's not a wake-up call on supply chain vulnerabilities, I don't know what is. And it's a reminder we need to take action here in our country to protect our most critical supply chains. As our semiconductor manufacturing has gone down over the last 2 decades, China has, not surprisingly, skyrocketed. It's gone from manufacturing 0 chips to 16% of the world's supply. And it plans to invest another $1.4 trillion in semiconductor technologies. Our country's lost ground to our global competitors. Unless we take action, it's estimated that by 2030, 83% of global semiconductor manufacturing capacity will be in Asia. That's exactly the type of trend China was hoping to achieve through their Made in China 2025 initiative, which seeks to achieve Chinese dominance in high-tech manufacturing. Everything from electric cars to advanced robotics to 5G to artificial intelligence to super fast computers. China wants to lead global production, and they want us to depend on them for access to the components. To be frank, that would create a huge risk for us and our allies. We need to bring these manufacturing jobs back to the United States and provide end-to-end security for our semiconductor supply chain, as well as to restore our global competitiveness and create jobs here at home. But as you know, it's easier said than done. Building a new foundry is a very, very expensive undertaking that simply will not happen without an investment from the federal government. The Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development estimates that 21 major semiconductor firms across a number of countries received more than $50 billion in government support between 2014 and 2018. Of course, some of those countries investing in manufacturing were South Korea, Singapore, Taiwan, Ireland, Germany, and you guessed it, China. If we're going to regain lost ground on semiconductor manufacturing, it's going to require a strategic investment from the federal government. And that's why my good friend, Senator Mark Warner, and I teamed up on a bill called CHIPS for America, which Stephen just mentioned. This legislation will restore American leadership in semiconductor manufacturing and ensure long-term national security and economic competitiveness. It achieves that goal by creating a federal incentive program through the Department of Commerce to encourage semiconductor manufacturing in the United States. It would help stimulate domestic advanced semiconductor manufacturing and boost both our national security and global competitiveness. It'll bring those manufacturing jobs back on shore and strengthen our vulnerable supply chains for our military systems, critical infrastructure, telecommunications, healthcare, agriculture, and manufacturing. Virtually every industry stands to benefit from a more secure semiconductor supply chain, and our economy would reap the benefits of bringing these jobs back home. I also worked hand in hand with Senator Tom Cotton and Senator Chuck Schumer in drafting an amendment that was adopted in the Defense Authorization Bill with bipartisan support. The vote was 96-4. You don't see many votes like that these days. So I'm eager to get the final version of the defense spending bill to the president's desk, accompanied by full funding, so we can restore American leadership. If we want our advanced technologies to run on made in America semiconductors, we need to pass this bill and provide these federal incentives. So thank you all for the opportunity to join me today to speak on this critical topic. I know we're all looking forward to today's panel, so let me turn it back to Stephen to kick things off.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Senator Cornyn, for that excellent presentation and for your leadership in the Senate on the CHIPS Act. We absolutely agree. It's important to get that legislation through the NDA and to have its key elements funded in full on a bipartisan basis in Congress and the administration. Thank you so much for your time today. Excellent. So now I will roll into a presentation regarding the report ITIF releases this morning. Allow me 1 second as I pull it up. All right. Well, for those who don't know, the Information Technology and Innovation Foundation is a nonprofit, nonpartisan science and technology policy think tank based in Washington, D.C., with a mission for advocating for public policies, laws, and regulations that drive innovation-based economic growth across the U.S., our states, and the broader global economy. We advance innovation policy in a wide range of tech areas, from clean energy and broadband to biotechnology and information technology. So, as Senator Cornyn said, there's truly no industry in the world more important today alongside biotechnology and the semiconductor industry. We're looking at a $470 billion industry underpinning an $11.5 trillion global digital economy that McKinsey estimates accounts for about 1/4 of global GDP today. If you look at the semiconductor industry itself, it's responsible for more broadly empowering and contributing $2.5 trillion annually to global GDP. And it's really the foundational technology that's driving advances in fields like artificial intelligence, high performance computing, quantum, the Internet of Things, making driverless cars, smart cities, smart grids, smart infrastructure possible. John, if it wasn't for your industry, we wouldn't all be together on this Zoom today. So thank you for making it possible. The industry has truly been driven by Moore's law. This is the notion that the number of transistors on a microchip doubles every 2 years, leading to a doubling of the speed and processing power of the semiconductor, even as the cost of that semiconductor halves. And so it's really this dynamic that has driven productivity growth across the entire global economy. If you look at the semiconductor sector alone, for the past 50 years, it has recorded total productivity growth 25 times the average of every other US industry. So it's semiconductors that's driving the global economy. Last year, semiconductor companies shipped over 1 trillion semiconductors, some containing over 30 billion transistors. And at the 5 nanometer and now 3 nanometer levels, we're looking at sizes smaller than even the coronavirus. And this is an industry that truly fundamentally depends on global value chains, both for innovation and for production. So innovation in this sector has been driven and depends upon a rich tapestry of scientists, researchers, and engineers working together internationally across a variety of companies, universities, government agencies, and public-private research consortia. On the production side, we have a fully globalized industry. There are truly three core elements of value creation or addition in the semiconductor industry: chip design, chip fabrication or manufacturing, and then what's called ATP, or the assembly, test, and package process. When you look at the industry globally, on average, each segment of these semiconductor global value chains has enterprises from 25 countries involved in the direct supply chain and 23 involved in support functions. A company like Intel, its supply chain encompasses more than 11,000 suppliers spread out over 90 countries. Korea's Samsung has 2,500 global suppliers. SK Hynix, 1,200. So we're looking at an industry that through these global value chains has been able to introduce new business models like the fabless foundry model. 50 years ago, you had an industry that was fully vertically integrated, where companies did every facet of chip design and manufacturing and testing. Now through these supply chains, we have contract manufacturers in Taiwan like TSMC who are able to take designs of leading companies like Qualcomm or Broadcom and then manufacture them very cost efficiently in other parts of the world. What's interesting, though, is that the scale, complexity, and cost required to push innovation forward in this industry only continues to intensify. If you look at the aforementioned TSMC, which is building a new 3-nanometer fab in Taiwan, this is going to cost them $20 billion. At that 5nm level for logic chips today, $20 billion is about the cost of a new fab. And whereas almost 30 companies manufactured integrated circuits at the leading edge of technology 30 years ago, only 5 are doing so today. And because this is an innovation-based industry that confronts peculiar economics, it means that certain conditions are going to have to attain across the global economy if innovation is going to flourish. First off, we're looking at an industry with peculiar economics, specifically that its average costs are much higher than its marginal cost, meaning that it can cost billions of dollars to make the first design of a chip or to build that first factory. But copies of the next chip come off the factory line at incremental cost. Now, because of this, semiconductor companies need access to large global markets or economies of scale if they're going to be able to recoup these very expensive upfront investment costs. At the same time, we must recognize that innovation in this industry depends upon the profits from one generation of innovation to finance investment in the next. So a company's investments in its 10-nanometer line begets the profits to invest in the 7 and 5-nanometer line. Because of this, it's imperative that competition in this global industry unfold on market-based terms. If we have countries that are providing excessive non-market-based subsidization, competition, this is going to prevent companies trying to compete on a market basis from being able to earn the revenues they need to invest in future generations of innovation. Likewise, we can't have forced localization requirements that unnecessarily fragment global production systems. We can't have a country saying you must manufacture your chips here if you're going to sell them here. And finally, we have to have the protection of intellectual rights because IP is the lifeblood of this global industry. Now, as an increasing number of countries recognize that this industry is vital for strategic and economic reasons, we're seeing an increasing number of nations introduce national semiconductor competitiveness strategies as they try to capture as much value added from this industry as possible. Senator Cornyn mentioned China's approach. Its national integrated circuit strategy originally called for $150 billion of investment, now up to $1.4 trillion. And this country actually seeks to establish a fully closed loop Chinese semiconductor ecosystem by the year 2035. Now, while it's perfectly fine if nations are looking to introduce policies to bolster their semiconductor sector competitiveness, based on investing in R&D and skills and talent and infrastructure. It's not when countries are using innovation mercantilist policies like stealing intellectual property, mandating technology or IP transfer as a condition of market access, or as China has done, explicitly stated that it intends to have their imports of US semiconductor exports by the year 2025 and eliminate them entirely by 2035. Competitive policies are fine as long as they are predicated upon the foundational WTO tenets of rules-governed, market-based, private enterprise-led trade in accordance with the foundational tenets of national treatment, non-discrimination, and reciprocity, which all countries have signed up to. Better examples here then are South Korea's launch last year of a new semiconductor competitiveness strategy that seeks to invest over 10 years, $830 million in semiconductor technology and talent development, train 17,000 engineers in the sector over that time, build public-private research consortia in South Korea. Similarly, in 2018, the European Union launched an 8-step, $1.75 billion action plan to bolster European competitiveness in microelectronics, including the introduction of an IPCEI, or Important Project of Common Interest in Microelectronics. In 2020, as Senator Cornyn said, the United States finally got into the game in terms of developing a concerted semiconductor competitiveness legislation and strategy with the CHIPS Act. Senator Cornyn mentioned the similar American Foundries Act introduced by Senators Cotton and Schumer. These two pieces of legislation have now been merged and are going through the NDAA, or National Defense Authorization Act process. Senator Cornyn mentioned most of these provisions in the legislation. I won't recount them in detail here. We're looking to increase R&D investment at US federal agencies by up to $12 billion in the CHIPS Act. Now, this is very important because 40 years ago, federal funding of semiconductor R&D was double the amount of private sector funding. But last year, private sector investment was actually over 20 times higher than federal investment of $1.7 billion in R&D in semiconductor research. So it's important to bolster the federal share. Senator Cornyn talked about the matching grants for WTO consistent state local incentives to attract fabs. That's important because a study finds that foreign government incentives have been responsible for as much as 40 to 70% of the higher total cost of ownership of semiconductor fabs in foreign nations as compared to the United States. There's a refundable 40% tax credit for investment in semiconductor equipment and facilities expenditures. And we should mention a $750 million multilateral security fund designed to support development and adoption of secure microelectronics and supply chains, therefore. Now, and as I mentioned, Congress should fully fund all those initiatives. Now, as I said, while it's totally appropriate for nations to implement strategies to bolster the competitiveness of their domestic semiconductor manufacturing industries, at the same time, there does exist opportunity for like-minded nations to collaborate in ways that collectively advance the competitiveness and innovation capacity of their semiconductor industries in a collective way. And that's really the intent of the report ITIF releases this morning called An Allied Approach to Semiconductor Leadership. Now, it identifies 4 broad areas in which like-minded nations can collaborate. First, coordinated technology development. Second, coordinated ecosystem support, such as working together to collaboratively develop voluntary industry-led standards, coordinated technology protection, and then supportive trade policies, regimes, and practices. And I'll address 1, 2, and 4 here in my following slides. So from Semitech to the Semiconductor Research Corporation, collaborative pre-competitive research consortia have played a pivotal driving role in driving semiconductor innovation and advancing Moore's Law, especially in part through developing commonly shared technology industry roadmaps. And while certainly close to market, applied R&D collaborations can be difficult, when nations have pooled their technologists together, they often find that at the 3 to 10 year time frame, there do exist opportunities for pre-competitive research collaborations that nations wouldn't likely be able to undertake as well alone. Research at those timescales, for instance, can include new approaches to computing architectures, such as in-memory compute, special purpose compute engines, brain-inspired neuromorphic computation, and quantum computing. And of course, a wonderful example here is really the international SRC-led decadal plan for semiconductors, which has worked to develop a strategic ecosystem vision to solve common challenges and align key stakeholders in the industry. The decadal plan has identified 5 key areas in which international stakeholders can collaborate, such as trying to decrease the amount of energy required to execute computations in computers, dealing with the data processing and storage deluge, and addressing emerging security challenges from hardware and AI to the cloud. And as the US in the CHIPS Act looks at introducing new types of pre-competitive research consortia, such as potentially new Manufacturing USA institutes focused on semiconductor innovation. Manufacturing USA, by the way, being a network of 15 institutes across America designed to drive forward advanced manufacturing product and process innovation. We have one in North Carolina called Power America that focuses on wide bandgap semiconductor electronics. We should introduce more as part of the CHIPS Act, whether for manufacturing design or fabrication. But it's important that participation be predicated on a notion of reciprocity, with the US encouraging companies from like-minded nations to join, so long as we can participate in their similar institutions. Power America, for instance, enjoys a collaboration of companies such as ABB, Siemens, and Infineon, so we should continue to try to identify international opportunities to collaborate in that space. Another area of focus comes from a 2017 PCAST, or Presidential Council of Advisors on Science and Technology report, called Ensuring Long-Term US Leadership in Semiconductors. And that report called for identifying, quote, carefully selected challenges or moonshots as focal points that could drive the industry forward. One thing that report noted is that it can take as many as 2,000 people up to 2 years to develop a new to the world semiconductor design. And we should try to endeavor to increase that time frame or decrease that time frame by a factor of 10. So looking at developing affordable desktop semiconductor fabrication facilities, building a commercial gate-based computer to work on large-scale problems. Now we should invite like-minded countries and enterprises that are in to participate in these types of long-term moonshots with the benefits in terms of intellectual property and technology they derive proportionate to the level of investment they make. And we should also explore opportunities to enroll enterprises from ally nations in a trusted foundry light approach. Now, trusted foundries refers to a Department of Defense initiative to assure the integrity and confidentiality of integrated circuits during the design and manufacturing phase. It has had some international collaborators, but we could do more. One thing we could do is recognize that there's a difference between cutting edge defense systems that need 3nm, 5nm semiconductor systems versus those that could be reasonably satisfied with legacy silicon, kind of older systems that can do fine with older 14 nanometer technologies. Another good example of collaboration here is the TSMC and Purdue Center for Secured Microelectronic Systems, which is looking to validate the security of these systems all the way through the supply chain. Beyond coordinating around semiconductor technology innovation, there's also opportunity to collaborate with like-minded countries with regard to semiconductor technology protection. Now, as many of you know, the US has been in the process of reviewing its export control regime. It is looking at applying export controls potentially on a class of EFTs or emerging or foundational technologies. The Department of Commerce's Bureau of Industry and Security is looking at this now. As we do so, though, it's important that we not place export controls on technologies and products that are already readily commercially available from foreign competitors. Now, Now, at the same time, in the multilateral area, the Wassenaar system is what we've used in recent decades to manage export controls on a multilateral process. Now, to be sure, there are many challenges with the Wassenaar system. It can take a very long time to add a technology to a control list, so much so that by the time agreement can be reached, the technology has often substantially evolved. So it is time for a new approach that walks the line between unilateral export controls and the need to develop a more ambitious and effective plurilateral approach. So the US should really, to the greatest extent possible, look to eschew the application of unilateral controls and align like-minded nations that have indigenous semiconductor production capacity in a common export control scheme. Now, we can leverage a new platform called MAST, or the Multilateral Action on Sensitive Technologies, to do so. This is an initiative the US has led that has brought at least 15 industrial nations together to share information and best practices across 4 issue areas: export controls, investment screening, visa screening, and technology transfer threats. We should continue to use MAST as a platform to work with ally nations on aligning export controls, and also as a way to increase information exchange on foreign investment screening practices among ally nations, and really expanding the list of accepted foreign states kind of on the green list for US investment screening procedures. We also need to work among like-minded countries to combat foreign semiconductor intellectual property theft. Ways we could do so here would be to further develop and exchange lists of foreign enterprises and individuals engaged in intellectual property theft and restrict them from competing in allied nations and markets. The US should further develop a Five Eyes-like alliance focused on combating state-sponsored economic espionage in advanced technology industries. For those who don't know, the Five Eyes represents an alliance among Australia, Canada, New Zealand, the United States, and the United Kingdom, where there's joint cooperation in exchanging signals, military and human intelligence. The Five Eyes has been more of a defense perspective. We could expand the approach more in a commercial setting to combat foreign economic espionage. Lastly, here, we can work more with ally nations to strengthen their trade secret regimes, especially through venues like the OPEC, the APEC and the OECD. Taiwan, in particular, should be recognized as one nation that over the past year has made tremendous advances in strengthening its trade secret regime. And that's very important for a nation that truly represents a bulwark for freedom, democracy, and market-based trade in that critical region of the world. But lastly, like-minded countries have an opportunity to collaborate on developing trade rules, regimes, and norms that can collectively drive the global semiconductor industry forward. At first, we should continue to work to expand the Information Technology Agreement, the ITA. This is an agreement that now encompasses over 80 countries in which they have agreed to fully eliminate tariffs on over 300 types of key information technology products, from laptops to cell phones to semiconductors. Nations that have not joined the ITA have actually seen their participation in global value chains for information and communication technology products decline by 60% since the year ITA went into force in 1996. ITA is good for countries, it's good for global trade, it's good for the global digital economy. We should maintain the WTO e-commerce customs duty moratorium, first introduced in 1995 and renewed every 2 years. This is an agreement among WTO members that they will not impose customs duties on e-commerce transactions. This will need to be renewed again next year by the WTO. Now, some countries see the siren song of customs duties and are looking at introducing this. But studies find India, for instance, would actually lose $2 billion in GDP if they were to introduce these types of duties. It's important that countries recognize that the tariffs, the duties they would collect from these types of measures are far less than the economic damage they would do to their own economies. We need to substantially expand subsidies disciplines within the World Trade Organization. This is something the Trilateral Trade Ministers Working Group is looking at. I should do several things here. We should insist upon timely and complete notification of subsidies. We should establish a presumption of prejudice towards subsidies that are not timely notified. We should clarify the definition of a public body and obligate subsidizing nations to specify that a given subsidy does not inflict harm upon other enterprises or nations. Finally, the United States should join the CPTPP and work to bring like-minded nations such as South Korea and Taiwan aboard. In conclusion, it's totally appropriate for nations within WTO rules to compete fiercely to maximize value added from their semiconductor industries. These competitive strategies, including in the US, are much needed. However, we should not forget that there do exist ways that like-minded nations can collaborate to collectively advance the competitiveness of their respective industries, and recognize that nations that elect to do so are likely to enjoy a competitive advantage over countries that elect to pursue autarkic or closed-loop strategies. And that can be the US as much as it could be China. Collaboration with our partners is important in this sector. So with that, thank you for your time. And I will now turn the conversation over to our fellow panelists, beginning with John Neuffer.
Thanks so much, and thanks for inviting me, and hello everybody. Let me just say a first few initial comments on Senator Cornyn's remarks. We in the semiconductor industry applaud the great leadership of Senator Cornyn, Senator Warner, and for this CHIPS Act legislation. This legislation is a long time coming, and it's what's remarkable about it is it's bipartisan at a time when it's very hard to find bipartisan cooperation on the Hill. And we've had very strong support from the administration. We have Ian here and Corey, Ian from Commerce and Corey from State Department. Secretaries Ross and Pompeo have been big supporters of this legislation. The reason why it's so important is, well, the semiconductor industry is, we control about half the global market. We're very strong in design. We're very strong when it comes to innovation. But when it comes to semiconductor manufacturing, we've slipped. In 1990, we accounted for about 37% of global semiconductor production. Now we account for about 12%. A report that recently came out, we did jointly with the Boston Consulting Group, estimates that in 10 years, if we stay on the same trajectory, we'll drop 20% lower than we are right now. So I think that the pandemic, some geopolitical things related to China have really conspired to show that we need to rebalance our supply chains. And one of our weak points is we don't have enough manufacturing in the U.S. And don't get me wrong, this session is about collaborating with allies in regard to our sector. We're not talking about withdrawing all of our supply chains from overseas. That would be not smart, and it would be prohibitively expensive. What we're talking about is over the next 10 years, there's going to be a 56% increase in semiconductor production capacity. And that's being driven by all these great technologies like autonomous vehicles, AI, e-health, 5G and 5G and beyond. So there's going to be a huge expansion demand for semiconductors, and a lot of fabs are going to be built around the world to create these semiconductors. We want to make sure that America is a place where a lot of these fabs will be built. That is our overriding objective here. It's good for our economy. It's good for our national security. So, we very much applaud Senator Cornyn, Senator Warner. There's also the complementary Cotton and Schumer bill, which we strongly support, and we hope we can get these bills there. They've been merged, as Stephen said, in the Defense Authorization Act. We're very, very encouraged that it's gotten this far so fast, and we think we'll get authorization. The next thing we need to do is get some money wrapped around these bills, get some funding for them. So about your report, Stephen, as usual, great report. If you weren't doing this, given your attention to detail, you should have been a neurosurgeon, Stephen. I mean, it's a fabulous report. It is chock full of a lot of interesting ideas and recommendations. I think some of them are very practical and we strongly support. Some of them may be a little bit ambitious and some would say Panglossian. But great read. I recommend anybody who wants to understand how our industry works and what needs to be done to make it better, would recommend you read this report. A couple of things that really stood out for me, Stephen. One is your recommendations about export control. That for us right now, better collaboration with our allies on export control is really, that's a sweet spot for us in terms of what needs to be done, what we'd like our government to be focused on. You know, when export control is done unilaterally, it ends up not being very effective. You know, we had an experience fairly recently where there were some controls put on over a year ago that were put on Huawei. And, you know, the United States we control about half the market, but there's a lot of strong competition out there in Korea and in Taiwan and in Europe. And so what happened was controls were put on us to sell stuff to Huawei. And what resulted was a massive shift in market from us selling to Huawei to our competitors selling to Huawei. And things have changed since then. Rules have changed in this regard. But that was an example where you really need to have multilateral cooperation. Now, when it comes to multilateral, I'm not necessarily talking about VOSNAR. VOSNAR is very important, and we need to do what we can to strengthen it. But in this kind of fast-changing world where technologies are evolving very quickly, and the fact that we have a player out there, China, that plays by different roles, we need to be able to work closely with like-minded economies on export control so that we can all work together and get good outcomes. So I can't agree with you more, Stephen, that export control needs to be a big focus here. And I think the plurilateral approaches are the way we have to go here. Just a couple more things on collaborating on research. You know, we already do a ton of this in terms of basic science and pre-competitive research. You know, in our space, the Semiconductor Research Corporation, headquartered down in North Carolina, is what's very important for us. I'm actually on the board there, and there's a lot of international companies there that work with our U.S. companies. But there's a couple of tricky things here. One, as soon as you get into kind of the applied space instead of pre-competitive space, it's harder to successfully carry out research because these companies in semiconductors are so fiercely competitive. But when it comes to foreign players, I couldn't agree with you more that reciprocity is absolutely necessary. And we have to recognize, though, that because it's such a fierce industry, fiercely competitive industry, and because there are national security implications around all this, there's always going to be some limitations when we talk about collaborating in research. Protecting IP, absolutely lifeblood of the industry. Kind of liked your idea of putting together a list of bad actors, international list of bad actors, and going after them. Subsidies, another huge problem area for our industry. We know that China is it's not, you know, what's happening in China is not just that there's subsidies, it's that there are massive subsidies that could create, almost certainly will create, enormous non-market driven overcapacity. So, right now the WTO is not in a great place to be addressing such a complicated issue, but we hope someday it can be, because it really needs to have more strict disciplines on subsidies. And then finally, something that's near and dear to me is greater international collaboration to expand membership in the ITA, and maybe even make another crack at expanding the product coverage of the ITA. That's very important. The semiconductor industry has benefited more than any other industry from the information technology agreement. The zero in, zero out treatment at the border provided to semiconductors, and many of the products that semiconductors have gone into has just been transformational for our industry, and we couldn't agree with you more. And we would like to get back to, with a big push to get the agreement expanded in 2015. It basically doubled the coverage of these enabling technologies that promote growth and innovation and societal benefits across the board. It's been 5 years since then. I can't believe it, but I would love to be able to get back to trying to expand that agreement some more. There was a lot left on the table in 2015, and it's just a no-brainer for us in the semiconductor industry. So, Stephen, once again, really, really great report, great panel, and I look forward to hearing from other panelists and maybe taking a few questions. Thanks.
He's muted.
James, yeah. James?
Thanks.
Jim Lewis, thanks.
Great, thanks. I'll echo all the comments, thanking everyone and saying it's a great report. It's very timely. Let's look at this from a slightly higher level. China has one big advantage over the US, and that is that they're willing to spend money, right? And we have lagged in that. So the Chinese will always so far outspend us. Sometimes it can be 100 to 1 in some of these technology areas. The US advantage is we have a much more robust market system, and we have allies. So that's one of the things I'd like to talk about. It's clear now that we're going to need to invest more in R&D, in science and technology education. We'll have to use subsidies to bring manufacturing capacity back to the US. And we might want to think about tax credits. I know this has been a sticky issue for some, but we will have to take a look at it. As we've all discussed, part of this will involve modernizing our export controls. It's still pretty much the system we had in the last century, needs to be updated. I think people know that now. The Wassenaar arrangement in particular was very focused on hardware and on specific controls with specific levels that might have been appropriate or was appropriate in the 1990s, but now needs to be rethought. Where are we in terms of working with our partners? Japan is there. The Japanese were ahead of us in some ways, in that their idea was to block exports of semiconductor manufacturing equipment. So, and in fact, at first they were not met with a completely warm reception to that idea in Washington. I think that's changed, but Japan is a very strong ally. And of course, if you look at some markets, Japan and the US are dominant. So it's very important that we work with them. Who's left? The European Union is key, right? Getting the Europeans on board is essential. And to get the Europeans on board, Germany is key. We just completed a project interviewing a number of Europeans about Chinese investment. And one of the common themes was, if you get Germany, the European Union is 80% there. And if you get Germany and France, it's pretty much a done deal. So we need to think about what is it we can do with the Germans. And the Germans do have a semiconductor industry, so they have an interest in this. Honestly, one of the problems with the Five Eyes is the Five Eyes isn't the right grouping, right? So the UK, they have ARM, but you'd want the Netherlands, you'd want Germany, you'd want Sweden. It's a different cast. You want Japan. It's maybe it adds up to 5. I think it probably adds up to more than 5. But the idea of a select partnership to reinforce Wassenaar, I think would be welcomed by some of our allies, but not all, right? Why aren't they all going to welcome it? First, particularly in Europe, they don't see the competition with China as a military problem. They know that the PLA is not going to be invading Europe. And so for them, they've downplayed the military aspects entirely until recently. Now they're getting a little worried about Russia. But Russia is not China. And so while they might be willing to think militarily about Russia, they're not there for China. For them, it's an economic issue. And you've seen a number of actions in the European Union that point to the fact that they are on the same trajectory that we have been on. They realize China is a problem. They have new foreign investment rules. It doesn't name China by name, but when you talk to European officials, they say the intent is to block China. They're looking at export controls. They're looking at investment in R&D. But we have some political issues we have to get out of the way. Privacy in the Schrems agreement. We'll need to find some way to accommodate the Europeans on privacy. That doesn't mean adopt GDPR in toto. Privacy rules in Europe have been very damaging to their tech industry in the past. And that should be a warning sign, but maybe there's some room for a compromise there. They're worried about competitiveness. So whereas we worry about Huawei and Alibaba, they add a few giant American companies to that list. We'll have to think about how we deal with them on competitiveness. What you hear when you go to Brussels, and someday we'll be able to go back to Brussels, they say we want digital sovereignty. And I've had one of them, a commissioner, even say, look, we don't want to be captured by the Chinese, but we don't want to be captured by the Americans either. We want digital sovereignty. And I think that's a mistake. It's a mistake on their part to think that somehow they are separate from us. And we have an opportunity because it'll be much easier for us to build a partnership with the Europeans on technology than it will be for the Chinese. We share values, we share culture. This should be easy to do. So it's in our interest to have a strong European partner, to have a strong European economy, right? And working with them, they have dilemmas, would be in our interest. And that's where the idea of some sort of tech alliance, tech partnership is, I think, very valuable. So what does the US need to do? First and foremost, it needs to invest in, particularly in the hard sciences, where we have lagged in recent decades. It needs to think about how we build partnerships with our allies, and that's where the report makes a valuable contribution. It needs to think about how we control transfers. And while we are doing that with the Export Control Reform Act, with FIRMA, the Investment Act, we could pick up the pace there a little bit. That would be beneficial. We need to do more on Chinese spying. What are the correct responses to Chinese espionage? And in some ways, things like TikTok make the Chinese aware that there's a penalty for being perceived as untrustworthy. We need to do more of that. We need to build facilities in the US, and you've heard about that. Everyone else has talked about it, so I won't say much. But ultimately, we're going to need to redefine industrial policy. Industrial policy is how the US won its global wars, right? And that means that whereas this phrase was radioactive maybe 5 years ago, now we need to think about it again. But it will not be the industrial policy of the Cold War. It will not be Eisenhower. Eisenhower's policy was great, tremendous work, but we need to do something different because things have changed. If you look at innovation, the source is the private sector. If you look at the tech base, it's transnational, right? So how do you design a policy that takes those two things into account? I think that's the work for us in the next few years. Finally, I'll just echo it because everyone else has said it too. We need to fund the CHIPS Act. It's good that we got the authorization bill. It's a great bill, but so far, no appropriations. And as you all know, in the American system, it takes two to tango. So let's focus on the problem. Let's work with our allies, and let's start competing with the Chinese when it comes to spending. I'll stop there, Stephen.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Jim. Excellent. Okay, Ian and Corey, again, we so much appreciate your being with us today. And I respect the line you have to walk in government, of course, between advancing U.S. domestic competitiveness in these industries, but also collaborating with our international partners. So if we can, Mackenzie, get Ian unmuted, I will turn the floor over to you, Ian.
Well, Stephen, thank you so much for inviting myself and Corey to participate in this distinguished panel. As Secretary Ross has said on numerous occasions, a secure, vibrant, and competitive ecosystem enables the United States to remain at the forefront of advanced semiconductor fabrication, which is critical to the nation's continued leadership in high technology innovation and to the security of our domestic supply chain. In addition to efforts to retain and attract semiconductor research and development, design, manufacturing, and now advanced test and packaging capabilities, this administration has and will continue to prioritize further strengthening strong partnerships with U.S. semiconductor commercial leaders and like-minded global players who share our desire to see this industry continue to thrive on the basis of the competitiveness of the private sector companies and their products, reciprocal access to one another's markets, open R&D infrastructure, and I will say that no one company can single-handedly solve some of the technological challenges on the horizon or reap the huge market alone. We've seen this in the past, and we want to encourage the type of partnership that you've envisioned. With this said, I welcome the bold ideas, considerations, and analysis that ITIF has put forth to further strengthen leadership in design, manufacturing, and R&D. On behalf of the department and on behalf of Secretary Ross, we have also enjoyed working with Senator Cornyn and the Senate and House colleagues on what is likely the most consequential bipartisan effort to propel the chip industry into the future in the last couple of decades. I really appreciate the working relationship that we've had. In addition, we also understand that we must invest federal funds in pre-competitive research to ensure we sustain our leadership in design and R&D and manufacturing associated with the next generation technologies. These include efforts to develop leading-edge metrology and digital tools to authenticate and verify chip capabilities to enable a secure supply chain, while also prioritizing basic research on advanced materials and device architecture. I very much appreciated John's reference to the Semiconductor Research Corporation, who has been a great partner of the federal government over the last 4 decades. And I just want to take a moment to also thank a person that has personally devoted a lot of his time, and that would be Dr. John Kelly of IBM, who has just been one of the longest serving members of that organization. We applaud the successful efforts to shape the industry's cooperative technological program for years and bringing in leaders, both domestic and like-minded global players to those programs that really have changed the trajectory of this industry while maintaining U.S. leadership. These programs not only sustain U.S. technology capability, but train the next generation of talent at well over 40 universities around the country. And while there have been many acronyms associated with these programs over the years, from Semitech in the 80s to FCRP, NCORE, ERI, and JUMP today, it's clearly made a difference. And I know Corey will also focus on the manufacturing investment, leveling the playing field efforts. But I did want to take a moment to highlight what has already been done and what needs to be done on the technology front as well. As you know, NIST has been a part of many of these programs, and I look forward to hearing your ideas to ensure we have a collective vision that leverages the know-how from the private sector, as well as the shared infrastructure and our university talent. For those of you who have been in this industry for some time, we've seen these challenges before. As Jim alluded to, in the 80s, Japan attempted to capture this industry's leadership through some unfair trade means, while also heavily investing in technology research. We responded then, and we will lead now by continuing to outrun and out-innovate. That is first and foremost on Secretary Ross's mind. While the players and landscape have changed, our determination and quest to maintain and grow our leadership in this critical industry has not. 10 years after the last launch of astronauts from U.S. soil on a SpaceX capsule docked at the ISS, having carried 2 astronauts hundreds of miles using semiconductor technology developed here in the United States. And while semiconductors is measured in the success in semiconductors is measured in nanometers, not miles, the Trump administration is committed to the same inspiring result. We will once again restore America's rightful place in a technology and a manufacturing base that grew up here, was invented here, and ensure the thousands of good jobs that are sustained by this industry continue to be fueled by it. We really look forward to working with all of you who have joined to meet the objectives of this monumental mission, and applaud those of you who have contributed to that mission to date. We thank all of the folks on the line that are supporting U.S. manufacturing and the jobs that you've created here in the United States. Thank you, and back to you, Stephen.
Ian, thank you so much for your remarks, for being with us today, and for your leadership in the government on these issues. Corey, the floor is yours.
Great. Good afternoon, everybody. Nice to see the great list, and thank you, Stephen, for inviting me on this very distinguished panel. One thing I'd like to do is just point out your report, like everybody else has. Phenomenal, great, bold recommendations. And these are things that help us shape our thoughts going forward. You don't want the government to come in and say, here is what we need to do across private sector. That's what somebody else is doing, and that's what we're here to talk about today, is how do we level that playing field. I know Senator Cornyn may not be on, but we really applaud his leadership, along with Senator Warner, Senator Cotton, and Senator Schumer, to get legislation put in place that says one thing. It says, we, as the United States, will draw a line and we choose to compete. And when we say we choose to compete, it's to compete against what John said was these heavy, massive subsidies by China. It's not about us competing with other like-minded nations. It's about our like-minded nations coming together to compete with the massive subsidies that are being deployed in a very market-distorting way. What's best about going last is you're the last speaker in before the conversation gets started. But the best thing is most of the other panelists, if it's a good panel, have had this discussion already. I'd just like to quickly recap a few things so we get to the discussion. One, what's at stake? We've all talked about it. Your report pointed it out. SIA's reports pointed it out. We know what's at stake. Semiconductors underpin technological products that drive national security solutions, foster economic growth, and contribute to societal advancements. It's a crude oil of the information age, and it's a bedrock for technology advancements that consumers may or may not know what they're getting into. I mean, everything that we're doing, all the devices that everybody's watching it on today, these AirPods in my ear, all are driven by this great technology. Prior to my stint in industrial policy at DoD, I'm a naval officer. I flew E-2 Hawkeyes and got the privilege of flying F-18. So I've deployed some great technologies of semiconductors, and they will drive national security. And it is why we need to take measures on the production side to ensure that, one, as we figure out the incentive structure, that America is stepping in to the competitive space to give others an alternative solution for either tooling exports or for manufacturing diversification of supply chains. Currently, as everybody's pointed out, we lack targeted incentives that attract semiconductor companies to manufacture here in the United States. And it's our belief that this impacts everything from tooling to R&D, and we want to make sure that we keep that competitive playing field resilient, level, and robust. Obviously, folks have mentioned the over $450 billion global industry today that'll grow to $1 trillion by 2030. As John pointed out, and we really rely on our partners in industry at SIA, and also think tanks like CSIS and reports like yours, Stephen, at ITIF, our manufacturing has continued to decline. And so the Chips for America, the American Foundries Act say we need to figure out how to reverse this trend. I know Ian and I, when we talk, we love a quote from the Defense Science Board in 2005 that could have been written yesterday that says, had the United States not been complicit in this manufacturing decline, you would think it was the expert work of a strategic adversary to erode our leadership in this and really pull the rug out from under us. That was written in 2005 when they noticed this problem, and it's 15 years later. It's about time that we do something, and thanks to Senator Cornyn and the legislation on the floor, let's take it that last quarter mile. A couple figures in 2019 of the 26 multi-billion-dollar advanced fabs under construction globally, 1 in the United States, 17 in China. These are things that we are seeking, with our like-minded partners and allies to get a handle on, and again, reset that playing field. What I'd like to do is just close really quickly on a couple points. One, Senator Cornyn pointed out the COVID and PPE dilemma that we faced. It would be devastating if all of our supply chains for microelectronics, for semiconductors, were located in a specific area, and we're worried about disruption of supply, especially given what we've seen is very aggressive behavior from a strategic adversary like China. But your report points out a number of recommendations. The beauty of this conversation is that it's in constant motion. And, John Neuffer is no stranger to us at State Department. Ian is no stranger to us at State Department, and Senator Cornyn and other legislators are not strangers to us as well. It's a constant conversation that we're trying to best balance. As I look through the list of questions that have been asked, a lot of it says complex problem, complex industry. It's very complex. And so, what we rely on are conversations just like this to figure out how best to fine tune our approach and our prioritization. So again, thank you very much for pulling this together, and we look forward to the discussion.
Thank you so very much, Corey. I appreciate those remarks. We were originally scheduled to go to 12:45, but as we had to await Senator Cornyn's arrival, perhaps we could say we go to about 10 minutes more and have some time for Q&A here, if that's all right. I invite the panelists to look at that Slido application. If there are any questions they might be particularly interested to respond to, but I will ask a couple that I thought were particularly pertinent. I'll also say 2 things. One, someone asked, what is CPTPP? That's the Comprehensive and Progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreements. Slides are available actually right now on the ITIF website, as is the report, and the BCG report that was referenced is available via the SIA website. But we have a question, and I'll just put these out to all the panelists if you wish to respond. So Mackenzie, please be sure that all panelists are unmuted. But the question is, can we empower U.S. manufacturing while retaining our ability to buy semiconductors at low cost so that our domestic end products remain cost competitive? I guess the question is, can we manufacture these semiconductors at a competitive price point so consumers can use them early?
Yeah, that's never really been the problem. I think what we're identifying here is that it costs 40–50% more to create a fab overseas than it does here, and that's what we struggle with. And unless we close that delta, manufacturing is going to happen overseas, and it will be, and we'll create competitively priced semiconductors, which go into competitively priced goods.
Excellent. Again, open question to the co-panelists. Question, what impacts economic and strategic with the possibility of adding SMIC, this is the Chinese Semiconductor Manufacturing Corporation, to the BIS entity list have? Are there viable national security concerns here that are worth the economic cost?
You're asking some tough questions, Stephen.
This is from your audience. This isn't from me.
Well, I'll take a first crack at it. SMIC sells to the People's Liberation Army. They say that they don't, but they do, right? And that's disconcerting to begin with, is that they deny something that we know is true. Do you want to be selling to the PLA? And we can have a discussion. The term of art in the Commerce Department is a commodity chip. One of the chip companies, I used that in some comments I made, and one of the chip companies called me up and said, our products aren't commodities, they're highly advanced. It's like, yeah, I get it. But if the chips are controllable, or if the semiconductor manufacturing equipment is controllable, why would we want to sell it if the ultimate end user is the PLA?
So let me just throw out something as a general statement, and that is export controls should really be narrowly tailored and focused on technologies that represent national security risk. We feel very strongly that technologies that are for commercial use just shouldn't be regulated. It's a slippery slope when we start doing that. Suppose others did that to us. It's a very, very, very tricky question.
But this is why we have dual use goods, because there's some goods that are not military, not munitions, but contribute to a country's military capabilities. So I agree with you. Drawing the line is important.
Jim, let me just put a stark question out there. Should we stop selling soybeans to China because PLA soldiers eat the soybeans?
It's not a good parallel, because one, a lot of foreign producers of soybeans. Two, soybeans not a critical or advanced technology. We're talking about semiconductors here, not soybeans. So no, I've even said that to people in the administration. It's like, if the Chinese make our berets for our army, does that mean we want to stop buying them? The answer should be no, but we have to draw the line somewhere. And this is a debate that goes back to the dawn of time and export controls. They're commodity. This is why the commerce rules are actually not bad. If it's a commodity, if it's a foreign available, if it's impossible to control, let it go. If it only has civilian uses, let it go. But in this case, in the case of SMIC, not entirely true. You guys are being awfully quiet. I'm carrying your water here.
Good. Corey or Ian, any comments on that one? And I'll add one question. And of course, the idea of this report was, what kind of role the U.S. can play and kind of like spearheading such alliances. But the question I would also add is in a positive, constructive way, what would you typically like to see from our allied partners for them to step up and offer leadership in some of these ways? How can we expect more of our partners internationally in these types of innovation or technology protection issues?
I won't address. Am I unmuted? I think I am. I won't address the Commerce's BIS and export control. That is clearly not my lane. But I will address what John. I believe John brought up, was this military civil, or I'm sorry, it was Jim, the military civil fusion strategy of China, right? It's well known, it's deliberate, and it's very targeted. And I won't get into the specifics of this, but it's something that we are concerned about. I want to maybe shift to the point that these conversations are taking place on a daily basis. I know Ian has several foreign commercial service officers deployed globally. Our state diplomats are in constant conversations with our allies and partners to find that space. And again, it goes back to my point that we are in constant motion with this conversation, not only within the interagency, but across our partners and allies, across industry. It is a complex problem set that we always hope to get a right answer to, right? And as a U.S. government, you always wish you could go to the Department of Semiconductor Competitiveness. But that office is spread throughout several different departments, as is the research and development. And so your point is right on the money. How do you get alignment across? And again, it is a constant conversation that we're involved in. Ian, anything from you?
Yeah, I will say that, on this one, certainly this is not my territory, as BIS is, a separate entity within the Department of Commerce that oversees the activities on the export control regime here in the Department of Commerce. But I would just echo what Corey has indicated. I have folks in 70 markets around the globe, and we're in constant touch with all of our like-minded partners to ensure some of the principles that we talked about earlier are followed, and that is the competitiveness of companies should be the fundamental determinant of market success.
Perhaps the only argument Rob and I had about this paper was whether or not we should include a section on talent and education. So there are several questions here from the audience asking, what is the role of institutions of higher education in assisting the growth of the domestic semiconductor industry? How do we ensure we have a sufficient supply of talented engineers being educated in this country to support these grand plans to expand the industry?
So roughly 3 in 4 graduates from with computer science and electrical engineering degrees are non-US. So roughly 3/4 of the talent we're educating here is non-US, and that's something the US government really needs to give some more focus to. So that's on the STEM side, STEM talent side. On the other side is immigration. There's a lot of shortages of talented engineers in the semiconductor industry for recruiting. Our universities do a fabulous job of training Americans and non-Americans in computer sciences, and we also do a fabulous job of chasing them away once they get their degrees. And that's because of our immigration system. It's just really become unworkable. So we have to 2 fronts. We got to bolster our STEM education efforts, and we got to fix our immigration system so we can keep the talent here. Because what happens is we train the talent here in our universities, our top flight universities, chase them home, and they go work for the competition. And that doesn't seem like a great strategy.
Just Steve,
Go ahead.
I add that in my remarks I stated the importance of funding the university programs through the pre-competitive R&D work through NIST, NSF, DARPA, and DOE, and certainly those programs have educated countless engineers that have went on to have very successful careers and grow the domestic industry. So I think there's a tangential benefit that's directly related to the R&D funding on this front, and certainly the administration's focus on the vocational education has been well received by many in the industry, as well as we focus on the technicians that are actually operating in these fabs. So that is another development that we've seen implemented.
Hey, Stephen, let me just throw in one thing. I believe Ian mentioned this, and I just really want to underscore the importance on the research side. Critically included in these pieces of legislations are authorizations for programs to bolster U.S. government investments in research programs in semiconductors. Over the past decades, the U.S. government has not been upping its game. While other countries, China in particular, but Korea, Europe, others they've gotten it figured out, and we need to make the strategic choice to make a change here and put more money into semiconductor research. Our industry itself invests about 20% of its sales back into R&D, more than any other industry in the world except for pharmaceuticals, and we're right up there 1 and 2. So on the private sector side, our industry is one of the most research and R&D intensive industries in the world. We're committed in the private sector to plowing tremendous dollars back into R&D. We need to get the U.S. government focused on that too, because there's certain kinds of research, pre-competitive research, that's very hard for companies to collaborate on because they're so fiercely competitive, and that's where there's a strong, important role for government here, and we're very encouraged that this legislation acknowledges that and includes programming that would help address this problem.
So it is a tough problem. Let me just throw in something. You know, we need to increase the number of Americans in these programs, and you know, to come back to the spend money point, if you poll college students and say, would you go into STEM if I gave you, say, a full ride, you get about 80% of them saying yes. So we can buy more engineers and scientists, but until we do that, we have to do something. And this is the reason I wanted to say this. Is 20 years ago, the CEO of one of the big chip companies told me, everyone who gets a PhD in one of these programs, the PhD should come with a green card stapled to it.
Yeah.
It's a cliche, but we haven't done it. Yeah, there's problems about espionage and immigration and all that, but you know, most of these people would probably prefer to stay here than go home. So let's take advantage of that.
Let me ask one final question, and we'll wrap it up out of respect for the time of the audience and the panelists. Senator Cornyn mentioned the Chinese plans, $1.4 trillion in this industry. If we were to add up all the wonderful things in the CHIPS Act, we get to about $25 billion. I guess my question is America ready for the reality of the competition that across semiconductors, biotech, clean energy, this country is going to have to mobilize its resources in a serious way if we're going to remain competitive in the technology, in the industries of the future? What needs to be done to communicate with the American public and our policymakers alike that these are critical investments that we have to undertake together for our strategic competitiveness?
Well, the good news is that the Chinese are inefficient and at times corrupt. So you can usually divide whatever number they have by, you know, half or 0.6 or something. So there's a start. We're already a little closer. The bigger issue you raise is the last time we had to do this, the industrial policies that we had for the whole Cold War were generated by Sputnik. And so the question is, will there be a Sputnik moment where the people say, oh my gosh, we're in a competition? The Chinese are smart enough to try and avoid that kind of dramatic break, maybe when they land on the moon, or maybe when there'll be something else. But I think we're moving in the right direction. It's a good question, and others can say, are we moving fast enough? But we aren't going to have that Sputnik moment, I hope. But we will see Americans change their mind about the need to compete with China.
Jim, I think it was not a Sputnik moment, but I think the confluence of the pandemic, things happening in Hong Kong, and frankly, what that might mean for our vulnerabilities with relying so heavily on Taiwan with manufacturers, the most advanced nodes, and so much of our stuff, and increasing tension in the bilateral relations with China. I think that is all conspired to create an environment that has fundamentally changed how Washington thinks about semiconductor industry and frankly thinks about industrial policy in a way that I think may actually bring about some very, very helpful change here.
Just as a quick footnote, we did a project interviewing Europeans about Chinese investment, and without us, we were talking about money, and they spontaneously brought up Hong Kong and said it really bothered them. So that's encouraging if you want to build alliances, as we share a common dislike of China's actions in Hong Kong.
Ian, Corey, last words to you.
Well, Stephen, thank you. And again, thanks for a very productive session. I have no doubt in the capability of the U.S. Industry and our like-minded global partners that we will be able to outrun and continue to out-innovate. What's encouraging to me are the calls that Secretary and myself and others have fielded about the companies that have wanted to expand here in the U.S. over the course of the last couple of years, have done so through multi-billion-dollar announcements. The jobs that they've added in multiple states. I mean, this is an industry that fuels, just economic growth in over 18 states and continues to really just have a fundamental impact. I will say on the technology front, I do think we have our Sputnik moment in my view, and that is the country that develops the next logic switch will lead this industry in a way that, our nation led in vacuum tubes and integrated circuits. I think it is a race. And I think there are multiple, proof of concepts out there that we need to double down on. This is an industry that has come back time and time again, and we very much look forward, to an enhanced investment climate that will continue to attract manufacturers of all types of chips, along with bringing back some of the assembly, test, and packaging. I think if you look across the supply chain, ATP is very critical as well and very advanced. So we also need to be looking across the whole supply chain. Our semiconductor equipment manufacturers continue to do quite well. This is a unique moment in time, and I think we're prepared to step up, just given the conversations we've had today and the bipartisan leadership that has been exhibited as well. Thank you, Stephen.
Thank you, Ian.
Stephen, again, thank you very much for everybody in the audience that listened in today and participated with questions. Thank you. I echo everything that Ian said. We are committed to this. I am encouraged by the intense focus that this administration is placing on semiconductors, because the understanding is, and the reality is, this underpins everything we care about: 5G, defense systems, Internet of Things, AI, quantum, everything to come. And so we're committed to getting this right. Again, the conversation doesn't start when this panel ends, Stephen. It actually continues probably within the next hour with several calls. So thank you. And we appreciate you having us on board.
Wonderful. Corey, Ian, John, Jim, thank you so very much. Thank you to our audience for being with us today. Video of this event will be posted on the ITIF webpage by the end of the afternoon. With that, thank you all, and we look forward to continuing to collaborate with you on this important issue going forward. Have a great day.